Good evening. I'm Marlowe, and this is Marlowe's Evening Radio. The stones outside the studio have been holding the day's warmth longer than usual tonight, as if they are reluctant to let the dark take it all at once. I have set one small stone beside the lamp, not for any practical reason, only because it seemed to have arrived with something on its mind. Our account this evening comes from the night archives. From a tournament valley where stone giants gather not simply to dance, but to remind the land of shapes it is nearly forgotten. The record was kept by a rhythm listener, one of the quiet witnesses who stands at the edge of the basin and hears what the giant's steps say to the mountains. It concerns a crack-shouldered stone giant whose dance seemed too small for the tournament until the valley began to answer. Here is the account. The first thing to understand about the tournament valley is that it does not like to be called an arena. Visitors do it sometimes, especially those from lowland towns where contests are held on painted floors and winners are named before the dust has settled. They see the great stone basin, the sloping seats cut into the crater wall, the hanging bells, the mineral banners, and the enormous figures waiting beyond the rim, and they think they have understood the place. They call it an arena because it holds spectators, but the valley is older than spectacle. It was left behind by an old falling star, opened by rain, widened by frost, and made listening by centuries of footsteps. Its bowl shape gathers sound the way a hand gathers water. Every step placed in it travels through the ground, touches the buried ribs of the mountains, and returns changed. That is why the stone giants come there. The people of the slopes call the gathering a dance tournament because that is the nearest word they have, and because there are banners, witnesses, old honors, and turns more beautiful than they need to be. But the giants do not dance in order to defeat one another. Not truly. They dance to show what their mountains remember, to settle what has shifted badly, and sometimes to ask the land whether an old shape may safely return. I was standing at the eastern listening ledge when the first low bell sounded. The ledge is cut into the crater wall below the spectator tiers, close enough to feel giant steps through the knees, but far enough from the basin floor that a listener can hear the whole valley answer. In front of me stood 7 echo bowls made from different stones. River basalt heard pressure. Frost slate heard fractures. Old Bridge granite heard built things. Shell limestone heard water that had passed through. Green mountain glass heard old paths. The dark bowl at the end heard what the valley was not yet ready to say aloud. I did not judge the dances. That was never my place. I carried no winner's cord, no honor chisel, no banner hook. My work was quieter than that. I listened for dangerous echoes, for stress moving through the crater wall, for a rhythm that might wake a fault too sharply, or press a hidden spring the wrong way. If a dance risked harm, the low bells would be sounded, not to stop the giant in shame, but to ask for a gentler measure. Most giants respect the bells. They know stone can be wounded by admiration as easily as by force. By the time the first bell faded, the valley was already full. The slope seats held travelers from shale villages, goat-keepers from upper ledges, bridge watchers with brass handbells wrapped in cloth, road menders with dust on their boots, and families with blankets, seed cakes, and small stones from home. Farther up, bird herders sat with white staffs across their knees while their flocks circled high above the basin, careful not to cross the space where the giants would turn. The giants waited beyond the western rim. From a distance they looked like hills that had chosen to stand up. Some were terraced with scrub trees, some sharp-backed and veined with quartz, and one carried tiny cave mouths that made a low flute sound when the wind passed through. The largest had a crown of broken ridgeline and a face worn smooth by snow. The smallest stood near the back, not hidden, but easy to overlook. I noticed that one because of the shoulder. A long crack ran from the base of the neck across the upper arm, filled not with bright crystal or healing moss, but with a pale dust the color of old roadbeds. The giant was not small in any ordinary sense. Even seated, the figure rose higher than the watchtowers on the southern ridge. But among the gathered stone folk, this one had the narrowness of a roadside standing stone, something made to mark a place rather than dominate it. The bat carried no forest, no temple ruin, no shining vein, only weather marks, a few dried roots, and that pale dust caught in the cracked shoulder. The opening measures were large enough to satisfy anyone who had come only for wonder. A granite giant from the north pass stepped into the basin with both palms open, and the old bridge bowl gave a warm, steady hum. Somewhere far away, a bridge that had carried winter badly found its middle again. A green-veined giant danced for water, and the limestone bowl answered with the damp sound of an old streambed remembering how to bend. A cliff giant settled a loose shelf above the goat paths, and a frost-striped giant closed tiny cracks in distant roofs. From the listening ledge, a dance was understood by return. A single careful step that helped an old wall become safe again was worth more than a dozen shining turns. Still, there was pleasure in the gathering. Mineral banners shifted in the wind, cooking fires glowed behind the seats, and dust settled on travelers, listeners, children, honor keepers, and sleeping dogs alike. When the shadow of the western rim had crossed half the basin, the great ridgeline giant entered for the last formal measure before the open calls. Open calls are the part of the tournament when any giant who has brought a measure may step forward, even if the measure is old, minor, unfinished, or known only to one valley. The crowd often grows restless then, not with boredom exactly, but with the human weakness for scale. They have seen the great dances and expect the evening to widen. Instead, the valley sometimes asks them to notice something smaller. The ridgeline giant's measure was magnificent. Even I, who had trained myself to listen before admiring, felt it move through me. The giant raised both arms, shadows climbed the body like dark water, and the whole western side of the basin seemed to lean into the step. My echo bowls answered together. This was a pass-opening measure for one of the high seasonal crossings used by caravans, birds, and weather. When the giant lowered its arms, a cold wind came over the rim, carrying the scent of a path that had been blocked by late ice and would begin to show safe lines by morning. The honor stones warmed, and the ridgeline giant stepped back with the heaviness of a mountain that had spoken clearly. After such a dance, many expected the tournament to pause. Instead, the cracked-shouldered giant moved. There was no announcement. The smaller giant simply rose from the western edge and stepped down into the basin with the carefulness of someone entering a room where others are sleeping. At first, the crowd did not understand that this was a new measure. Some thought the giant had come to help smooth the floor after the ridgeline dance. Others shifted on their blankets, whispering softly, because the figure looked plain against the memory of the great pass-opening step. No mineral crown, no rushing dust, no ringing cave mouths. Only a narrow body of weathered stone and the pale roadbed dust held in the cracked shoulder. I looked to the echo bowls. None of them answered at first. That, more than the crowd's uncertainty, made me pay attention. A weak dance gives a weak echo. A mistaken dance gives a confused one. But the absence before the first step can mean the valley is making room for an old measure to return. The cracked-shouldered giant stood near the center of the basin, then placed one foot forward with strange exactness. The heel touched first, then the outer edge, then the full sole settled into the dust. The movement was so small compared to what had come before that many in the upper seats missed it entirely. A child laughed once, very softly, and was hushed by someone who did not yet know why. The green glass bowl gave a faint sound. It was not a ring. It was not even a hum. It was more like the first breath taken in a room long closed. The giant waited, then made a second movement, a slight turn of the hip, a drawing back of the right shoulder, and a pause long enough for the dust at its feet to settle into a thin line. That line did not spread like performance dust. It lay across the basin floor in a shape I could almost recognize, then disappeared under the next drift of evening air. The green glass bowl sounded again. This time the dark bowl answered beneath it. I placed both hands on the listening ledge. The stone was cool, but a thread of warmth moved through it from the basin floor. Not strong, not new. Familiar in the way an old road is familiar even when grass has covered it and no one has spoken its name for years. Behind me, someone whispered that the small giant's measure was too slight for the open call. I did not turn. The giant lifted the foot again and placed it almost where it had been before, but not quite. A correction no wider than a handspan. A human dancer might have made such a change for balance. A stone giant makes it for memory. The echo moved out through the basin, vanished under the southern wall, and returned through the green glass bowl with a tone so old that my first thought was not of dance, but of walking. I knew then that this was not an unfinished measure. It was a hidden one. I had heard something like it only once in training, played from a cracked listening tablet that most apprentices found dull after the storm and bridge measures. The old instructor had told us that some rhythms do not travel through mountains or rivers, but through absence. They are used when a path has been covered, forgotten, or believed gone, and when opening it by force would bring half the slope down with it. The old name came to me slowly. The returning path measure. I looked from the bowl to the cracked shoulder of the giant in the basin. The pale dust in that long fracture had begun to loosen, not falling, not blowing away, but shifting as if it had heard footsteps approaching from inside the stone. The crowd was quieter now. They did not understand the measure yet, but they had begun to feel the valley listening. The giant made no attempt to impress them. It did not raise both arms, did not strike the ground, did not turn the sky with its shoulders. It only placed another careful step into the basin, and somewhere beyond the tournament valley, a road that had been silent for years began, very faintly, to remember where it had been. A returning path measure refuses grandeur. It moves close to the surface, in small corrections and careful pauses, as if the dancer were listening for something buried just below hearing. I kept my hands near the echo bowls, not touching them, because a listener can dull a small measure by wanting too much from it. The other bowls did not join. There was no bridge strain, no winter roof, no buried stream, no cliff shelf asking to settle. Whatever the small giant was calling belonged to paths. The giant moved again. The left foot slid backward by a distance that would have meant nothing in an ordinary dance, then turned at the heel, drawing a half curve through the dust. It had the irregular bend of a trail going around a stone too large to move. The dust followed, briefly outlining a narrow line across the basin floor before the evening air folded it away. I heard a few spectators breathe out as if disappointed, but the green glass bowl answered with a low note that went through my wrist bones. I opened the drawer for path measures and found the copper-bound tablet. Its cracked surface carried the old forms of returning path dances, though I had never seen one wake in a living tournament. I set it beside the green glass bowl and waited for the next step. The giant lowered both arms, as if holding the memory of two sides of a road. The movement did not shake the crater wall, yet spectators on the southern tier turned their heads at almost the same moment, drawn by something under the seats. The green glass bowl rang once. On the copper-bound tablet, a thin line of dust lifted from the carved surface. Returning path measures belong to older centuries, when roads were understood as agreements between feet and land, not merely lines to be cleared. A buried road had to be reminded, not forced. In the basin, the small giant turned its right shoulder. The crack opened slightly, not breaking, only widening enough for the pale dust inside it to catch the evening light. I saw then that the dust was not just lodged there. It had layers. Some was gray with old landslide stone, some was brown with dried path earth, some was white with powdered milestone. Near the deepest part of the crack ran a faint dark streak like the mark left by wheels long after the road itself is gone. A bridge watcher on the lower slope made a small sound and pressed a hand against the wrapped bell at the chest. I glanced down and saw the figure staring not at the giant's feet, but at the shoulder. Bridge watchers often know roads that no longer appear on painted maps. They learn not only the bridges still standing, but the vanished approaches, the lost turns, the stones that once told travelers when to keep left of a stream. I wondered whether this watcher had recognized the dust before I did. The giant took the next step. It was the smallest yet. The foot rose barely clear of the basin and settled sideways, as if making room for someone else to pass. The movement crossed no impressive distance. It would not be remembered by any traveler who had come for spectacle. But the green glass bowl answered so strongly that the sound spilled into the limestone bowl beside it, and for a moment both bowls held the same tone: path and water, road and stream, walking and drinking. The tablet's lifted dust arranged itself into a curved mark, like the bend where a track comes near a creek before climbing away. The southern wall of the crater gave a faint reply, not a crack, not a shift, only a softness in the stone, a release of pressure that had been held for many years. The low bells did not ring, so there was no danger, but I placed one hand near the warning cord out of habit. The cracked-shouldered giant paused, letting the answer travel. That pause told me more than the step. A careless dancer would have pushed forward, delighted that the valley had finally spoken. This giant waited for the land to finish its thought. The crowd began to understand that the measure was not failed. Their restlessness changed to attention. People leaned forward without whispering. The road menders in the western seats took their hats from their knees and held them still. Another movement followed, this one through the upper body. The giant bent slightly from the waist, then straightened one notch less than before. The pale dust in the shoulder trembled and released a thin fall down the arm. Where it touched the basin floor, it did not scatter. It lay in little spaced marks, like stones once set along the side of a path. The green glass bowl gave the old note again, but now I heard not only the road itself, but travelers missing it without knowing they missed it. A missing path is not empty. It gathers the feet that turned elsewhere, the carts that took longer routes, the messages that arrived after the bread had cooled, and the visits postponed until they became impossible. The sound did not accuse. It simply held the shape of what would have been easier if the way had remained. The dust on the copper-bound tablet settled into its carved marks as the giant danced. I followed the pattern with my eyes, careful not to breathe across it. Heel set, outer edge, wait, shoulder draw, side room step, dust markers, water near turn. It was not a minor form. This was a deep returning path measure, one used when a road had not merely been blocked, but removed from habit. Beside me, the assistant listener looked up from the lower stool. Until then, the small dance had seemed to puzzle them. Now they watched the green glass with widened eyes. "That is not a contest measure," they said softly. "No," I answered. "Then what is it?" An old road listening for itself. The assistant said nothing after that, which was correct. Some explanations should be given only once. In the basin, the crack-shouldered giant began a turn. It was not round. A round turn belongs to plazas, courtyards, and open ground. This one had corners, hesitations, and a slight uphill resistance, though the basin floor was level. The giant turned as a walker turns when a path narrows beside a drop. It shifted weight carefully. It kept one foot near an invisible edge. It made room for a cart that was not there. It avoided a stone that had not yet appeared. As the turn continued, the southern crater wall darkened in a thin diagonal line. The spectators saw it then. A quiet stirring passed through them, but no one cried out. The line appeared high on the wall, just below a ledge where thorn bushes grew from cracks. It was too straight to be a natural shadow and too broken to be a new crack. It ran for several body lengths, vanished behind a bulge of stone, then reappeared lower down. I had looked at that wall for years from the listening ledge and never seen it. Now the giant's turning step had made the old alignment visible, not by moving the wall, but by reminding light where to fall. The bridge watcher in the lower seats stood. No one told the watcher to sit. The movement was slow and respectful. The wrapped bell remained held against the chest, but the watcher's face had changed. Recognition, when it comes after many years, does not always look like joy. Sometimes it looks like someone hearing a door open in a house they thought had been emptied. The small giant completed the turn and placed both feet still. The dust in the basin settled. The diagonal line on the southern wall remained. I wrote on the slate, possible returning path, southern wall response, witness recognition among bridge keepers. My hand moved carefully, but I felt the old excitement of a record becoming something more than record. A listener should not want a dance to become important. Wanting bends the ear. Still, I could not pretend the valley had not changed. What had looked like a small, plain measure had drawn a hidden road's first visible breath. The tournament elders sat under the north ledge, where the honor stones rested in a half circle. They did not interfere. Their task was to receive the completed meaning of a dance, not interrupt its becoming. Yet I saw one elder lean toward another, and the second touched the surface of a blank honor stone. Not warming it, not yet, only asking whether it was awake enough to listen. The cracked-shouldered giant turned its head toward the southern wall. It did not look at the crowd. It did not look at the elders. It looked at the faint diagonal line as if seeing an old companion through fog. Then it lifted one hand and placed the palm over the crack in its shoulder. The gesture was protective, almost private. The pale dust under the hand glowed once in the last of the evening light. The next step would matter. I knew it by the way the bowls went silent together. Even the green glass stopped ringing. Silence before a strong measure is not emptiness. It is the valley drawing all its listening inward. If the giant pressed too hard, the buried road might tear open. If it moved too softly, the path might sink back into forgetting. Returning a road is delicate work because the road has already learned how to be absent. The giant waited through one breath of wind, then another. On the southern wall, the faint line held. When the step came, it was not larger than the others. The giant simply lifted the forward foot, crossed it behind, and set it down at an angle that made the whole body face neither the basin nor the wall, but the space between them. The movement acknowledged both the place where the dance was happening and the place where its meaning belonged. Dust rose from the basin floor, but instead of spreading around the giant, it traveled in a thin stream toward the southern wall. The stream of dust reached the base of the wall and climbed. People in the lower seats drew back slightly, though there was no danger. The dust moved slowly, touching cracks, ledges, and thorn roots, then settling along the diagonal line. As it settled, small stones appeared within it, not new stones, but exposed edges of stones that had been there all along. A border, a step, a second step below it. A shallow cut where water had once crossed a path after rain. The old road did not open, but it showed that it remembered being a road. The green glass bowl sounded again, deeper than before. This time the note traveled through the listening ledge, through my hands, and into the copper-bound tablet. One of the old carved marks brightened under its dust. I read it with a tightening in my throat that had nothing to do with fear. Do not clear. Invite. That was the heart of the measure. The small giant lowered its hand from the cracked shoulder. The pale dust had shifted, leaving the crack cleaner near the top, darker near the base. I thought of all the years that dust must have rested there, carried not as decoration, but as memory. Perhaps the giant had stood near the landslide when the road was lost. Perhaps it had been made from the same slope. Perhaps a forgotten road, unable to move by itself, had found the nearest stone that would remember on its behalf. The world contains many ways for memory to travel without becoming explanation. The crowd was fully quiet now. No one laughed. No one whispered that the dance was too small. The tournament had turned toward the crack-shouldered giant with the grave attention usually given to the largest measures. Yet the giant did not change its manner. It did not grow taller under attention. It did not deepen the step for approval. It stayed with the road, and the road, faintly, stayed with it. I marked the tablet again. Returning path measure confirmed. Southern wall. Old road not to be forced. The assistant listener watched my hand. Do we warn the road menders? Not yet. They will want to go up there. Then they must want quietly. The assistant nodded and wrapped both hands around the warning cord without pulling it, ready in case the crowd forgot itself. But the crowd did not. Even the road menders remained seated, though I could see how their bodies leaned toward the wall. It is hard for those who mend roads to see a path answer and do nothing. Their kindness is active by nature. Still, this was not a road to be mended with picks and shovels, not first. The crack-shouldered giant began the next phrase. This one carried memory through repetition. Heel, outer edge, full sole, weight, shoulder draw, side room step, turn with corners. Face the between place. Each movement returned, but not exactly. The second time, the heel settled a little lower. The side room step left more space. The corner turn moved as if passing under branches. With each repetition, the old diagonal on the southern wall became less like a line and more like a choice the mountain had once made for travelers. As the light thinned, small things emerged along it. A half-buried marker stone. A ledge wide enough for 2 goats and a patient person. The remains of a retaining wall, no higher than a knee. Thorn bushes growing in a row that had seemed wild before but now revealed itself as the old edge of the path. These details came without drama. They appeared the way remembered things often do, one at a time, quietly, almost embarrassed to have been absent. The bridge watcher took one step down from the spectator tier and stopped. The wrapped bell at the watcher's chest trembled, not ringing, recognizing. The small giant heard it. I am certain of that, though the bell made no sound. The giant turned its head a little, just enough to acknowledge the watcher without drawing the crowd's eyes there. Then it placed both palms near the cracked shoulder and bowed, not to the watcher, not to the elders, not to the crowd, but toward the southern wall where the hidden road waited under dust and thorn. In the green glass bowl, the old path answered with a sound like feet going home slowly enough not to wake the house. I closed the copper-bound tablet halfway to protect the dust pattern from the wind. My role was still to listen, still to record, still to keep the bells ready if the valley strained. But by then I understood the shape of the evening. The largest dance had opened a high pass for caravans and weather. The water dance had taught an old stream bed how to bend. The bridge measure had eased a northern crossing before winter could break it, and the smallest-looking dance had found a road that had been missing from everyone except Stone. The cracked-shouldered giant had not come to win the tournament. It had come because somewhere under the southern wall a forgotten way was ready to be remembered without being torn open. The old records do not wait quickly, especially after generations of silence. The copper-bound tablet had accepted the first part of the measure, but deeper marks remained dull beneath their dust. I kept it half covered with felt while the cracked-shouldered giant continued. A listener learns not to stare too hard at a thing that is trying to remember itself. The giant's next phrase was quieter than the last. It shifted weight from one foot to the other, then let the left hand fall toward the basin floor without touching it. The gesture made no dramatic mark, but the green glass bowl received it with a long, narrow tone. I heard gravel under careful feet, a cartwheel turning slowly, and water nearby but not under the road. The limestone bowl answered only at the edge, which told me the path had once passed near a stream but had not followed it for long. I pulled the felt from the tablet a little farther. The carved marks had begun to fill themselves with pale dust. The marks now brightening belonged to Stonefall first, forgetting second. That order mattered. A road blocked suddenly carries a different memory from a road that fades by choice. The assistant listener saw my hand pause over the tablet. Stonefall? Yes, I said. And after that, forgetting. The words seemed to travel farther than I intended. A few people on the closest spectator ledge looked toward us, but no one spoke. The cracked-shouldered giant had turned slightly, and the diagonal line on the southern wall now held several visible stones along its lower edge. They were not newly placed. Their faces were old, worn by weather, and set at intervals too regular to be natural. A person might have walked past them for years and seen only rubble. Under the measure, they were becoming border stones again. The bridge watcher had not moved from the lower step. The covered bell trembled against the watcher's chest, and the cloth around it shifted with each silent vibration. I wondered how much the watcher remembered. There are people who inherit roads the way others inherit houses. They know a path not because they have walked all of it, but because a predecessor pointed to a ridge and said, "Once we went that way when the snow was kind." Then the ridge changes, the people move, the maps are redrawn, and the sentence remains without a path to hold it. The giant lowered its head and began the middle figure of the measure. This was where returning path dances often become dangerous. The dancer must give the old road enough sound to rise toward the surface, but not enough command to break through all at once. The crack-shouldered giant did it with a series of small placements. Foot down, wait. Foot drawn back, wait. Heel turned toward the wall, wait. Shoulder eased, wait. Each pause gave the mountain time to refuse. Each next movement came only after the bowls told us refusal had not come. The dark bowl finally spoke. Its sound was low and buried, with the feeling of packed earth against trapped air. The southern wall answered by shedding a fine veil of dust from the thorn bushes. I watched the slate bowl for fracture and the basalt for pressure. Neither gave a danger note. The dustfall was not collapse. It was the mountain loosening the outermost layer of its silence. Then the dark bowl gave a second tone, softer but deeper, and I understood what it had been holding back. The road had not only been covered by a landslide. Something had been on the road when the stone came down, perhaps a cart, a bridge marker, or an old signpost buried with its direction still pointing home. The crack-shouldered giant knew to wait. It stilled completely, one hand over the shoulder crack, one foot angled toward the wall. No one in the valley moved. Even the fires behind the seats seemed to lower themselves. The tournament elders remained seated under the north ledge, but one of them uncovered a small stone chisel and laid it across the lap. That did not mean judgment. It meant readiness to record if the dance found its true name. The silence lengthened. I used that stillness to read the tablet. The brightened marks had reached a section I had never seen active, not even in training copies. The carving was shallow, almost worn away, and the old translation at the margin had been scratched by time. I leaned close and traced the symbols without touching them. Road under stone, marker lost, bridge unvisited, bell without crossing. The final mark was a small open shape, like a gate seen from above. The bridge watcher knew before I did. The watcher unwrapped the bell. It was a handbell, dark brass, with a handle polished by use and a rim dented on one side. Such bells are used near mountain bridges in fog, not to summon people, but to tell them where the safe middle lies. This one had not rung yet. The watcher held it low with both hands and looked toward the southern wall as if seeing, in the dust and thorn, the other end of a bridge, long left without footsteps. The assistant whispered, "Should the bell be stopped?" "No," I said, "not unless it rings loudly." The watcher lifted the bell. The crack-shouldered giant turned one palm outward, a gesture of permission or perhaps recognition. The watcher rang the bell once, but so softly that most of the valley heard only the idea of a note. The sound crossed the basin and touched the green glass bowl. It did not disturb the measure. It completed something small within it. On the southern wall, a stone fell. It was no larger than a loaf of bread, and it tumbled only a short way before coming to rest. No one cried out. Behind the place where it had been, a darker surface appeared. At first I thought it was simply shadow. Then the dust shifted, and a carved arrow showed itself, pointing along the diagonal line of the old path. The arrow was worn nearly smooth, but beside it was the faint outline of a bridge bell, the same shape as the one in the watcher's hands. A breath moved through the crowd. Not applause. Not yet. More like everyone had remembered to breathe in the same room. The giant resumed. The next steps were no longer searching. They were careful, but certain. The returning path measure had found its witness in the valley and its echo in the bell. The green glass bowl held the main tone now, while the dark bowl gave depth beneath it. The tablet's final marks brightened one by one. As the measure continued, the old path on the southern wall became more legible. It did not open as a clean road. No great passage appeared. Instead, the mountain gave back clues. A line of retaining stones, a worn notch where people had once set their feet, the hidden base of a signpost, and a shallow resting place cut beside the trail. Thorn roots kept their hold, but loosened from the stones they did not belong to. The land was not being forced into usefulness. It was being allowed to remember its old agreement. I wrote as quickly as I dared. Returning path measure, deep form, southern wall, landslide burial, bridge marker recovered, living witness present, no clearing before settling. The last note I pressed harder than the others, because road menders love a visible path, and love can make people impatient. A returned road is tender at first. It must be greeted before it is used. The cracked-shouldered giant's movements grew even smaller. Near the end of such a measure, the dancer must become less important than the road. The giant stepped, waited, shifted, and waited again. Its arms lowered, its head remained turned toward the southern wall. The pale dust in the shoulder crack had thinned, revealing darker stone beneath, but not an empty wound. The crack looked cleaner now, as if some of what it carried had been given back. The bridge watcher rang the bell a second time. Again, softly. This time the sound did not travel to the wall first. It traveled down through the spectator stone, into the basin, through the giant's planted foot, and then outward along the buried line of the path. The green glass bowl answered with a tone I had never heard before, though I recognized the shape from the tablet. It was the return note. Not full completion, but acceptance. The valley had agreed that the road still belonged to it. The tournament elders rose. People stood slowly on the slopes, not cheering, not clapping, but giving the kind of attention that makes room around an event. The largest giants at the western rim bowed their heads. The ridgeline giant who had opened the high pass placed one hand against the ground, an old sign of respect from a large measure to a small one that is carried deep. The crack-shouldered giant took its final step. It was barely a step at all. The giant drew the forward foot back beside the other and let the full weight settle evenly into both soles. The motion closed the measure without sealing it. In the same moment, the dust line on the southern wall steadied. The carved arrow remained visible. The hidden signpost base held its place. The path above the thorn bushes did not sink back. The copper-bound tablet warmed under my hand. I looked down and saw a blank space at the bottom of the active measure. The stone there had softened enough to receive a new mark. That happens rarely. A tablet does not ask for addition unless the event has changed the measure's living record. I took the listener's stylus from its cloth case, but did not write at once. The question was not whether the dance had been skillful. It was not whether the giant had earned honor. The question was what the valley had actually accepted. The assistant listener looked from the tablet to me. Do we mark it as a winning step? I shook my head. No. The bridge watcher, still holding the bell, looked toward us from below. I pressed the stylus into the softened place and carved the old words with careful pressure. Path returned. The tablet took the mark. The green glass bowl rang once, very low and clear, and the sound passed through the basin without disturbing a single stone. In the sloped seats, people bowed their heads. Some placed hands on the small stones they had brought from home. The road menders did not rise. The bridge watchers covered their bells again. The old path, newly visible and not yet ready for feet, rested under the evening light. In the basin, the crack-shouldered giant remained still for a long while. No crown of mineral cloth was brought. No honor cord was tied around its arm. The tournament did not know how to decorate what had happened without making it smaller. At last, one of the elders carried a plain stone marker to the center of the basin and set it near the giant's foot. The marker was uncarved except for a shallow line that bent like a road avoiding a boulder. The giant touched it with 2 fingers. That was all. Yet the valley held the gesture as carefully as it had held the largest dance of the evening. I could feel it through the listening ledge, through the bowls, through the tablet still warm under my palm. The crack-shouldered giant had not won the tournament in the usual way, and perhaps it had never intended to. It had returned something quieter than victory, a way through the mountain, a bridge's forgotten approach, a direction that had waited under stone without becoming lost to itself. The official measures continued after the pause, but the tournament felt changed. A moss-backed giant settled old garden terraces. A narrow quartz giant danced for a line of winter cairns. Each measure was honored, and each deserved its mark, yet the southern wall kept drawing the eye. The old path did not widen, and no more stones fell. That was good. The line remained faint, but clear enough that once seen, it could not be unseen. Near the carved arrow, the thorn bushes had loosened from the retaining stones and settled their roots into safer cracks. After the final dance, the bridge watcher came to the listening ledge. The bell had been wrapped once more in cloth, though the hand holding it still trembled. Up close I could see its dented rim and the old cord tied around the handle, faded from years of weather. The watcher looked toward the southern wall and said, "That was the South Creek Road." A named road must be allowed to settle just as carefully as a visible one. The words moved through the bowls without touching them, yet the green glass gave the faintest response. The watcher heard nothing, I think, but felt something, because both hands tightened around the wrapped bell. "I was told it was gone," the watcher continued. "Not closed. Gone." "Who told you?" "My keeper before me. And the keeper before that, I suppose. The bridge was still watched for a while after the slide, though fewer came. Then the north way became safer. The maps changed. The bridge remained, but there was no road to bring anyone to it." The watcher looked toward the southern wall. "I thought the bell was kept only because we do not throw away a bridge bell while the bridge still stands." That was a bridge watcher answer, and it told me more than complaint would have. People of that duty often keep faith with crossings long after others choose easier routes. They polish signs no one reads, test planks no one steps on, and ring bells in fog even when no traveler answers. This watcher had inherited a bridge without its approach, a safe middle with no one arriving from either side. I opened the old route drawer beneath the listening stones. Human maps are useful, but they grow practical over time. Stone records are less efficient and more faithful. They keep the shape of ways that have fallen out of speech. The South Creek Road appeared on a thin slate tucked between two larger root stones. It was not listed as vanished. It was listed as underweight. Beside it were marks for a small bridge, 3 slope villages, a mill hollow, upper grazing paths, and a resting wall where travelers once placed baskets before the last climb. The last note beside the road was several generations old. Stonefall across upper approach. Do not cut. Await gentler return. The assistant listener leaned close enough to read, then drew back without touching. Await gentler return, they said. Yes. The bridge watcher closed the eyes for a moment. We waited so long we forgot we were waiting. No one answered that. The valley had already answered it better than we could. Below us, the cracked-shouldered giant began to move away from the basin center. Not dancing now, only walking toward the western rim with a tired care that made the size of the body feel less important than its weight. The pale dust in the shoulder crack had thinned, and in some places dark stones showed through like old earth after rain. The giant did not look back at the southern wall, though the wall seemed to hold the shape of the giant's steps in its own quiet way. The watcher saw the shoulder and lowered the wrapped bell. That dust, they said. Is it from the road? Some of it. How would a giant carry road dust in the shoulder? There were several possible answers, and none of them could be proven. Perhaps the giant had stood near the South Creek Road when the landslide came down and had taken the shock through its own stone. Perhaps the body had formed from broken material below that slope in the centuries after. Perhaps a forgotten road, unable to move by itself, had found the nearest stone that would remember on its behalf. The world contains many ways for memory to travel without becoming explanation. I think the road found a place to rest, I said. The watcher accepted that. Some people need reasons. Others only need a sentence strong enough to hold beside what they already know. Near the end of the evening, the watcher unwrapped the bell again and rang it low. The sound was soft enough to remain almost private, but the green glass bowl received it cleanly. Across the basin, the cracked-shouldered giant, now seated among the other stone folk at the western rim, lifted its head. The giant did not rise or bow. It only placed one hand lightly over the shoulder crack. On the southern wall, the visible arrow caught the last of the light and held it for a breath longer than the stones around it. That was when I understood that the road's return did not belong only to the mountain. It also belonged to the people who had kept objects without knowing why. A bell, a phrase, a watched bridge, a duty that seemed to have outlived its use. The dance had not restored everything. It had not brought back the lost years or the travelers who took longer ways, and it had not made the old villages young again. But it had joined the remaining pieces gently enough that none of them had to pretend they were whole before they were ready. Before leaving the ledge, I added one last note to the record. South Creek Road visible by evening light. Bridge bell answered. No passage until stones finish settling. The assistant listener read the note and looked toward the wall. Will people wait? I thought of the bridge watchers standing beside us with the bell wrapped again. Of the road menders still seated, though their hands longed for tools. Of the families who had watched a small dance become larger than spectacle. Waiting is difficult for people. It is less difficult when a thing has been named. They will now, I said. The morning after a return path is not really morning at first. It is a testing of light. The sun comes slowly over the tournament ridge, not because it is uncertain, but because the stones below need time to decide which surfaces they are ready to show. The southern wall took the first light along its upper ledges, then across the thorn roots, then down to the diagonal line that had been only shadow before the cracked-shouldered giant danced. Most of the spectators had slept in the slope seats or in the sheltered hollows behind them. No one had wanted to leave too quickly. A tournament usually empties in layers after the evening measures, with families packing blankets, road menders comparing tools, children carrying cooled cooking stones, and travelers speaking quietly about which dance had been finest. That night, departure had felt too loud. People wrapped themselves in cloaks, spoke in low voices, and stayed near enough to the basin that the valley could continue settling around them. I had slept only a little on the listening ledge, with the copper-bound tablet wrapped beside me and the echo bowls covered against dew. Through the night, the bowls gave only small resting sounds. Green glass for path, slate for harmless cooling, limestone for a trickle of water choosing a safe seam. The road had not changed its mind. When the first clear light reached the southern wall, the bridge watcher was already awake. The wrapped bell rested across both knees. Road menders gathered below the ledge, not with picks or crowbars, but with brushes, cloth, and thin measuring rods. That pleased me. Someone had spoken wisely to them in the dark, or perhaps the valley's stillness had done the speaking. They stood looking up at the southern wall with the careful hunger of people who love repair, and for once that hunger was patient. The cracked-shouldered giant remained seated at the western rim among the stone folk. In morning light, the giant looked neither larger nor smaller than before, but clearer. The shoulder crack had lost much of its pale dust. What remained lay in deeper seams, as if the road had taken back only what belonged to it and left the rest as memory. The plain marker stone still stood in the basin center, its shallow bent line turned toward the southern wall. Dew had gathered along the carving and made the line shine. The tournament elders came down before the sun touched the basin floor. They carried a chisel, a bowl of mineral ash, and a folded gray banner. This was not the hour for ordinary awards. What had happened with the South Creek Road required something older. They stopped beside the plain marker and waited until the cracked-shouldered giant rose. The giant's rising was quiet but immense. Dust moved from the knees, slid down the legs, and settled without clouding the air. A few sleeping spectators woke under their blankets. The bird herders looked down from the high shelves. The bridge watchers stood, holding the wrapped bell but not uncovering it. Everyone seemed to understand that this was not applause time. One elder touched the plain marker with the chisel. The sound was very small. The green glass bowl answered from the ledge, though it was still covered. I removed the cloth and saw a soft green line circling the inside rim. The basin had accepted the marker as part of the record. The elder carved beneath the bent road line using the old tournament script that is read more by hand than by eye. The words were not winner, champion, finest step, or first honor. They were the same words I had carved into the copper-bound tablet the night before. Path returned. The crowd saw the carving but did not cheer. Instead, people reached for the small stones they had brought from home. Some placed them against their foreheads, some held them to their lips. A child in the lower seats, still half asleep, tucked a pebble into the fold of a blanket as if keeping it warm. These were not gestures required by rule. They were the sort that appear when many people feel the same tenderness but have not agreed on how to show it. The elder with mineral ash approached the cracked-shouldered giant. The giant lowered one arm, making no request and offering no refusal. Ash was brushed lightly over the shoulder crack, not to fill it, but to show its cleaned edges. The dark stone beneath took the ash in a thin outline. From the ledge I could see the shape clearly now. The crack bent like a road skirting a fallen boulder. It had not been damage alone. It had been a held direction. The folded gray banner was open between the marker stone and the southern wall. No mineral dye had been added, but a pale line appeared across it, bending gently around an unseen obstacle. The banner did not display the giant's greatness. It displayed the road's return. That seemed right. The bridge watcher finally unwrapped the bell and turned it toward the southern wall. Its low note moved through the morning like warm breath over stone. Along the old path, the carved arrow caught light again, and below it a second marker stone showed itself, half buried but unmistakable. A murmur passed through the slopes, not excitement, recognition spreading. The road menders did not move uphill. Instead, they tied small moss-stuffed bells to a red cord and laid the cord along the base of the southern wall. The bells were not warnings for danger alone. They were promises of patience. When a path is newly returned, bells are placed nearby so wind, rain, goats, and people can learn its edges before feet begin to use it. For a while, the bells remain stuffed and silent. Later, when the stones have settled, the moss is removed one bell at a time. The crack-shouldered giant touched the carved words on the marker with 2 fingers, just as it had touched the uncarved stone the night before. Then it turned toward the southern wall and bowed. The bow was not deep, but it lasted long enough for the road to receive it. In the green glass bowl, the return note sounded once more, quieter than before and more settled. Only then did the crowd make sound. It was not applause in the lowland sense. People lifted bells, stones, cups, and walking staffs, and touched them lightly to the surfaces nearest them. wood against stone, brass against cloth, pebble against palm, staff against ledge. Thousands of small contacts made a soft rain of recognition around the crater. The sound did not demand that the giant turn toward it. It simply let the valley know that people had noticed. The crack-shouldered giant listened. Among stone folk, listening is sometimes the deepest form of receiving. Later, I walked with the bridge watcher and the assistant listener to the base of the southern wall. We did not climb. The red cord lay where the road menders had placed it, and the moss-stuffed bells rested against stone like sleeping seeds. From below, the old path was both clearer and more fragile than it had looked from the ledge. The first steps were there, but shallow. Retaining stones showed themselves in broken sequence. Thorn roots still crossed the way in places, though they no longer gripped the wall as fiercely. Higher up, the carved arrow pointed toward a turn hidden by shadow. The bridge watcher stood a long while without speaking. Then the bell was lifted, not rung, and touched gently to the first exposed border stone. "I know where it goes," the watcher said. The assistant asked softly, "To the bridge?" "To the bridge first." The watcher looked along the faint line of the path. Then to the mill hollow, if that hollow still remembers water, then to the 3 slope villages, though one may have no roofs left, then to the upper grazing fields, and from there, if the old turn remains, home for those who once came the longer way. I wrote that down later, but in the moment I did not reach for slate or stylus. Some words should be heard before they are kept. The crack-shouldered giant did not come to the wall. From the basin, I could see it seated again at the western rim, one hand resting over the shoulder, head slightly bowed. The posture was not sorrowful. It was the heaviness that follows giving back a memory carried too long. Around the giant, the larger stone folk sat in respectful space. None leaned close. None placed a hand on the shoulder. They understood that the road had returned, but the place where it had rested inside the giant would need its own settling. By midday, travelers began to leave the tournament valley by the known roads. They passed the southern wall slowly and lowered their voices near the red cord. Some tied threads below the bells, not on the path itself, but where patience had been marked. A goat keeper left a sprig of mountain thyme. A road mender placed a brush against a stone and then took it away again, deciding correctly that not yet meant not yet. The bridge watcher remained until the last low bell of morning was covered. When I returned to the listening ledge, the green glass bowl had gone quiet. That was a good sign. A road still crying out after return has been brought back too roughly. This one rested. The dark bowl gave nothing more, and the slate bowl held no fracture tone. The South Creek Road had not been opened. It had been remembered. There is more mercy in that difference than many travelers understand. I closed the copper-bound tablet and tied it in felt. On the outside tag I wrote the southern wall response, the bridge bell witness, and the name of the measure. Then, after a pause, I added one more line in smaller script. Danced by the crack-shouldered giant who carried road dust. The assistant listener watched me tie the cord around the tablet. Will that be enough? For the record? For the road. I looked toward the southern wall, where the red cord and quiet bells held the first boundary of patience. Above them, the old arrow remained visible in the afternoon light. "No," I said, "but it will be a beginning that does not harm it. That, for a returned road, is often the best beginning." The road was not open during the tournament. That is important to say clearly, because people who hear later versions of the story sometimes imagine a brighter ending. They imagine the southern walls splitting wide, the old path shining from end to end, and crowds climbing toward it with lanterns and songs. Perhaps some stories need such endings. This one did not. The South Creek Road returned first as permission, not passage. For 3 days after the measure, the red cord remained at the base of the wall and the small bells stayed stuffed with moss. Road menders came each morning with brushes, then left without cutting a single root. The bridge watcher visited with the wrapped bell, and children were told not that the road had opened, but that it had come back and was resting. I remained in the valley until the first settling was complete. The tournament moved on around us in its ancient way. Giants received marks. Families packed blankets. Mineral banners were folded, and cooking fires were buried under clean sand. The largest giants departed slowly over the western rim, each leaving a little of its measure behind in the basin. The crack-shouldered giant did not leave with them. It sat near the western rim through the second day, hands on the knees, the clean shoulder turned toward the southern wall. People did not crowd it. A few placed small stones on the ground at a respectful distance, proof that they understood something had been carried for them. On the third morning, the green glass bowl woke before sunrise. It gave one low tone, clear and narrow, and then became still. I uncovered it and found a line of dew gathered along the inside rim in the shape of a bend around a boulder. The southern wall had no new movement, but the red cord below it had slackened slightly. The moss-stuffed bells leaned toward the first visible step as if listening to a conversation just beyond hearing. The bridge watcher arrived carrying the bell unwrapped, not raised, not ready to call travelers, only unwrapped. The road menders came behind, carrying brushes in both hands. We watched the first moss removed from the smallest bell on the red cord. The bell gave almost no sound when the wind touched it. A thin note passed along the first stones of the path and vanished before reaching the thorn roots. The green glass bowl answered from the ledge. That was the sign. The road menders began. They did not dig. They did not cut. They brushed loose dust from the first border stone, lifted one fallen twig away from the carved arrow, and pressed their palms against the retaining stones to feel which ones were ready to hold. One thorn root had to be moved, but it was not torn out. It was guided into a neighboring crack and packed with damp moss. Another stone, loosened by the old slide, was marked with red thread and left alone. The work was so small that from the spectator seats it would have been difficult to see anything happening at all. Yet by midday, the first 3 steps of the South Creek Road could be followed with the eye. Not walked. Not yet. But followed. The bridge watcher rang the bell low once, and the note went up the path, touched the carved arrow, and returned with a softness that made the watcher close both eyes. I saw then that the road's return had given the watchers something more complicated than happiness. A lost way coming back does not erase the years without it. It brings those years into the light and asks them to sit beside the present. The watchers stood very still after the bell faded, and none of us interrupted. Near the western rim, the cracked-shouldered giant rose. The movement took time. Dust slid down in small streams. The little stones people had left nearby trembled but did not roll. When the giant stood fully, the whole valley seemed to recognize the height again, though it had been there all along. The giant looked toward the southern wall, then toward the basin center where the plain marker still stood. The marked path returned was visible from the ledge, now only because dew had settled in the carved letters. The giant did not approach the road. Instead, it turned to leave by the western rim. That seemed right. The road had been returned to the valley, not kept by the one who carried its dust. The bridge watcher lifted the bell but did not ring it. The road menders lowered their brushes. The assistant listener bowed without meaning to, then looked embarrassed, though no one saw except me. The crack-shouldered giant placed one hand over the cleaned line in its shoulder, and for a moment the shape of the crack and the shape of the visible road on the wall seemed to answer one another. Then the giant walked out of the tournament valley. Its steps were steady, not grand. No measure followed them. No dust rose into figures. It was only a stone giant leaving after having done what it came to do. But the basin held each footprint for a while before letting the wind soften it. When the western rim was empty, I returned to the listening ledge and finished the record. I added the first settling note, the low bell response, the 3 visible steps, the moved thorn root, and the departure of the cracked-shouldered giant after the road accepted its own boundary. Then I closed the tablet and placed it in the route drawer, not among victories, not among spectacles, but among returned ways. The assistant listener stood beside me, watching the southern wall. When will people walk it? When the bells are empty of moss, I said. All of them. All that need to be. And after that, then someone will walk only to the first turn, then someone else to the bridge. Then perhaps, one morning, a person from the upper grazing fields will come down by that road without thinking of it as a miracle at all. The assistant smiled softly. That seems a small ending. It is the best kind for a road. By evening, most of the tournament valley had emptied. The mineral banners were gone, and the slope seats held only dust, forgotten seed husks, and the warmth of where people had sat. The low bells were wrapped, the echo bowls rested under cloth. On the southern wall, the first little bell on the red cord moved now and then in the wind, making its almost sound. The road above it remained pale, incomplete, and present. Before I left the ledge, I looked once more toward the western rim. The cracked-shouldered giant was no longer visible. Beyond the rim lay other slopes, other measures, other silences in need of careful steps. Perhaps the giant would become a hill somewhere for a century. Perhaps it would join another gathering. Perhaps it would carry only its own stone for a while, which is not a small thing. The South Creek Road waited in the evening light, not lost, not hurried, not fully open. Home is sometimes like that. It returns first as a line one can believe in, then as a step, then as a way that carries feet without asking to be praised. I recorded what I had witnessed, wrapped the green glass bowl in felt, and left the valley by the known road, while the forgotten one rested above me, slowly becoming ordinary again. And I thought that perhaps this was why the giants still came to dance in the old crater. Not to be watched by us, though we watched them. Not to win honors, though honors were given. They came because stone remembers the world in shapes too large for speech, and sometimes a single careful dance can return a path without breaking the mountain that forgot it. Marlowe returns now, and the studio feels very still after that account. I find myself thinking of roads that do not need to be rushed, and of the kindness of letting a returned thing rest before asking it to carry us. If there is a world you have wondered about, a place you have imagined, or a quiet corner of another universe you would like us to look into, you may leave it in the comments. Marlowe has a strange habit of gently opening doors we did not even know existed. For tonight, may your steps be gentle, may your old roads remember you kindly, and may the dark hold steady under your dreams. This has been Marlowe's Evening Radio. Good night.